Okay, well, as promised, we are going to have a lecture this week. I'm sure you're all very thrilled. But I went to the National Association for School Psychologists annual conference 2 weeks ago in San Antonio. And while we were there, I went to a session, and it was titled The Effective Support for School Crisis, Case Law, and Ethics. And Dr. Scott Poland, who is a seminal person in case law and crisis events in schools, he's hired across the United States to represent individuals who feel like the schools have wronged them. And he also has been employed by some school districts before. In fact, he told us that he's not against schools and he's not against individuals, but he's on the side of suicide prevention. He's on the side of crisis prevention. And so whatever he can do to prevent the death of an individual, that's what side he is on. He is the co-director of the Suicide and Violence Prevention Office, and he's from Nova Southeastern University. And at the end of the lecture, we'll get into a little bit more about what he specifically does, but if you can't tell, I fangirled a little bit over him. I was very excited to sit in one of his lectures. What we were talking about is case law and different court cases that have been tried in the United States and how they affect crisis and crisis prevention and intervention in schools. The learner objectives, and you can follow along with the slides that I've posted, but we are to analyze lessons from school crisis lawsuits that are brought against the school for failure to obtain parental permission prior to intervention. So that's step one. The second thing that we'll be looking at is we'll be able to describe importance of documentation of parent notification and best practice intervention when a student is known to be suicidal or self-injurious. And that's something very important for those of you who want to work in schools. You have to document those parent interactions. You have to have it written down. You have to tell other people about it. It can't just be a phone call and no one knows about it but you and the parent. And then finally, the third thing that is our learning objective for this lecture is to analyze lessons from lawsuits against schools for failing to address bullying issues and then conducting inadequate threat assessments. So thus far in this course, we have read about threat assessments and what they need to consist of. And we've also talked about the prevention of bullying. And so you'll be able to apply many of the things that we have talked about in the class previously to this lecture and to these slides. Once again, NASP stands for the National Association of School Psychologists, but we have a model for comprehensive and integrated services, and in that Domain 6 is that prevention and response services, so everything that we're talking about in our class right now falls into that Domain 6, which requires us to have knowledge of risk and resiliency factors, which you all do now after the first half of this course. And then the ability to participate in crisis prevention and intervention, which you should also all be prepared to do. And then to address problems such as bullying, school safety, mental health, suicide, and youth violence. And this is something that you have a cursory, you have a little bit of knowledge in just because of what we've covered. And you will know enough by the end of this course to know if your school is doing an adequate job of addressing these issues. And if they are not, you will have resources like this textbook, the best practice textbook. Speaking of which, I'm just going to hold it up. This is what our textbook looks like. If you don't have this book and you have a different one, the bookstore gave you the wrong book. Go switch it. Little side note, I've run into that problem a little bit lately reading some of your reaction papers. So, Dr. Poland made sure that we knew that there are many, many legal cases that have implications for crisis intervention and prevention, and school psychologists, as well as special education teachers, teachers in general, administrators, basically anyone in a school. School psychology literature about ethical issues is lacking, and if the school psychology literature is, you'll find that the education literature is severely lacking. And then he made sure to tell us the following cases are all ones that he has personally been involved in. So these are people that he has represented. And these are outcomes that are real. This is definitely a real life situation. So this first one is Choquette versus Onsted in Michigan schools. In this case, an elementary age student they were driving home on the school bus, and they stopped, and over here in this yard, there is a suicide victim hanging from a tree. The school bus driver did a very good job of bringing that kid that he had let off back onto the bus, turning the bus around, and going to that pre-approved spot. He called the administrators and let them know what had happened, and they immediately called parents. And they, debriefed everybody. Parents picked their kids up, and then the next day, there was a group activity provided for all bus riders, and that was grades 1 through 6. Now, it could be argued that having a single activity for grades 1 through 6 with so many different developmental levels could be viewed as inappropriate. However, the school thought that in this case, the older students could be supportive of the younger students, and they were the activity was built along with that kind of cohort support system, and so that ended up being fine. The problem came up when one family, they didn't want their first grader to be told the truth. They had told, it was close to Halloween, and they had told their first grade student that it was just a Halloween prank and that nothing had happened. And so they, after this group activity, pulled this girl out of school and sued the school for informing her that it was in fact a suicide and that she had seen a dead person. The suit was for $10 million, and it claimed that the young girl had PTSD as a result of the intervention, not as a result of viewing the actual body. Now, this really ties in with what we have read in the last couple weeks about how adults' reactions to a crisis event can really shape how a child interprets it. However, in this case, we must ask ourselves, did the school do anything wrong? 1. And 2, is it within the parents' rights to have the truth withheld from their child? The school prevailed in this lawsuit, and the judge ruled that during crisis situations, we do not have to have parental permission in emergency situations. And so we don't have to have that permission to have this group activity or to intervene, especially if it's best practice. And from what we have also read in class, we know that having this type of support and talking about it is best practice in these types of situations. And so that is that first lawsuit. Something really interesting. Questions, that next little part. So things to think about is, what do you think about this lawsuit? And how would you defend the school psychologist and counselor who were named? My answer for that is that I would go to our book, and I would go to other resources, and I would be able to say that having this type of activity, having this type of response is what is considered best practice in the field. And so they were acting in best practice. And then once again, was it appropriate to conduct one intervention session for all bus riders, grades 1 through 6? I think this really depends on how you do the intervention. All interventions for 6th graders are not going to be appropriate for those for 1st graders. The developmental levels are very different. However, if you structure the intervention in a way that we talked about previously, it can be very beneficial. And then question 4, should parent permission have been obtained prior to the intervention with students? And the judge ruled that it did not have to be.